Welcome to Reddit Quests. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more videos. Reddit, what's the scariest experience you've ever been through? Story 1. I was 13 years old, and my dad had just picked me up from high school but had my grandma in the car too, so I sat in the back seat. We were driving back home and my grandma wanted to quickly run into a shop, so we parked up outside the shop. My gran was having trouble getting up the steps out front of the shop, so my dad jumped out to help her. At that exact moment, I noticed my dad's gold chain he lost a couple of weeks ago under the seat in front of me, so ducked down and reached under to get it. As I'm trying to reach under the seat, someone got in the car. I looked up and they kinda looked like my dad from behind, so I said, "Dad?" They turned around and I immediately saw it wasn't my dad. They clearly didn't realize anyone else was in the car and were a little startled but quickly replied, "Sit back and shut up, I'll let you out in a minute." The key was still in the ignition and they started the car and peeled off. I have never really felt fear like it. All the worst kinds of thoughts rushed through my head, and I was convinced they had stolen the car because I was in it. But they drove down a couple of streets and pulled over and just said, "Okay, get out." I ran back to the shop and halfway ran straight into the arms of my dad, who had been running after the car. I could literally feel the relief that he was feeling through that hug. Story 2. Tick-borne encephalitis. I didn't even know a tick had bitten me and went from headache to shivers and extreme fever until I wasn't able to walk without my wife supporting me. Even reading made my head spin like crazy and I didn't know what the reason was. Luckily, I managed to fully recover, most likely thanks to my wife supporting me as good as she could and my dog forcing me to keep as active as it was possible at the time. But it took 4 months to fully recover. Story 3. About a month ago, my neighbor asked me to go check on her 72F husband, 75M, which wasn't super out of the ordinary. I've done it before when she can't get a hold of him. Went in through the garage, called for him, no response. Continued to walk through the house and found him on the floor of the TV room, unresponsive, but still breathing, snoring loudly with phlegm coming from nose and mouth. Called 911 for the first time in my life, then had to call my neighbor to give her the news. Paramedics showed up and took him to the hospital before she arrived back at home. He had a brain aneurysm, ruptured, and passed away a few hours later at the hospital. Gary was a wonderful man that was like a stand-in grandpa for my 3 kids who don't have any family in town. We are so grateful to have known him and the love and snacks he always shared with my babes. Story 4. Drowning. I was jumping off some high rocks into a river. It was a place in the town I grew up in that everyone knew. One day I somehow got turned around in the water after hitting and swam down. When I realized and turned around, I was too deep to make it up. About 8 feet down I inhaled water. It burned and was cold at the same time. I could feel the pain in my ears as I tried to exhale the water. I don't remember surfacing, my friends pulling me to shore or coughing up all the water. Story 5. I was in a hospital for months because of something else, couldn't get up and had already lost a ton of weight, which made me severely underweight. Then caught some kind of virus, the doctors couldn't figure out what it was, and got weaker every day. I couldn't eat or drink and vomited all the time. At some point what I spat out was entirely black, probably dried blood. I can hardly remember that time of my life, but looking in the mirror and seeing my bloodshot eyes where all the veins popped, and my chin and neck with burns from the acidity and stomach fluid and my skinny arms and ribs was horrifying. I think I was around 14 at the time and was sure I'd die. It went on for days and then just stopped. We thought it was that hospital virus that happens sometimes, but apparently it wasn't. Still don't know what happened and how I survived. Story 6. Back in the early 2000s, I lived in northern Minnesota. I was born and raised in Louisiana, so direct opposite side of the US, where the only ice on the roads was when someone dumped out a cooler into the street. At the time, I was dating a Canadian girl and went to spend Christmas with her and her family. Drove across the border, went to Ontario, had a good time. I came back across the border a few days after Christmas, sometime late afternoon. It was a 5-ish hour drive from her house to mine. Being the middle of winter, the sun went down very early, so it was dark by the time I got to the first town in Minnesota. I drove down Highway 61, which runs along Lake Superior and is dotted with blink-and-miss towns. No one travels that highway that late unless they live there or are a trucker usually driving from Duluth to Thunder Bay. The roads were clear, no snow, no ice that I could see, so I cruised along at my usual 60 miles per hour. I hit a curve that had a patch of black ice and sailed off the road. One side of the road was an almost 90-degree drop straight into Lake Superior. The other was into a forest. I sailed into the forest, barrel rolled a few times, and landed on my wheels in a ravine. I credit my seatbelt for saving my life, so now I'm strict about that when anyone gets into my car. So there were a few problems. First, cell phones weren't nearly as ubiquitous as they are now, and by extension cell towers weren't covering as much area. I had a cheap prepaid cell phone but no signal. Second, I was in a ravine, so I was hard to see on a road that was hardly traveled anyway. Third, it was the middle of winter, and I think in the single digits, somewhere between 0 and 10F. I had a blanket I kept in my car in case ish hit the fan like that, but that won't do good for long since I had to stand on side of the road to be seen, and hope no one else skidded on the ice and squashed me. I for certain thought I was going to freeze to death. A local guy named John, who lived in the town of Schroeder, found me. He brought me to the hospital, I think up in Grand Marais, and even let me stay with him for a few days until someone could come get me. He had a long-distance calling card, remember those? That I used to call my roommates and girlfriend to let them know I was alive. I spent the first day sleeping from the painkillers, nothing broken but everything hurt. The second day, one of my closest friends said she would come up from Duluth the following day to get me. I slept a lot that day too, and I found out John had this massive collection of musical instruments and played blues. That's what we bonded over, that, and him literally saving my life. I found out recently he passed away a few years ago, though I'm not sure where his grave is, but I've been trying to find out just so I can pay my respects. Story 7. At about 10 years old, I fell through ice on a pond. When I came back up, I smacked into ice, instead of the hole I fell through. The water was too murky to see any light from the hole, and I thought that I was witnessing the end of my short life. I was lucky to find the opening again, but as I tried to get back up, the ice kept breaking and I'd go under again. The whole event probably lasted 30 seconds. But to me, it was a lifetime. It's been 35 years and I'm still nervous on a frozen body of water, even if cars and trucks are driving on it. Story 8. I survived a chainsaw accident to the throat, the 16th of March 2022. Trachea, thyroid, and epiglottis, hope I spell those right, were each in 2 parts. The operating doc came by 2 days afterwards with huge eyes and told me about the puzzle pieces he had to put back together. I'm basically fully recovered except for my voice that sounds a bit hoarse because of nerve damage. It is slowly recovering, and I'm going for speech therapy. At the beginning though, I did sound a bit like Lemmy Kilmister, and thought about reviving Motorhead. Story 9. Watching my 3-year-old son wither away due to leukemia to the point he was so weak he couldn't walk, sit up, talk, and we would have to hold his head in place so that he could watch Paw Patrol. He's now almost 4 and back to walking again and seems to be winning this long, hard battle. Story 10. My son's brain surgery. He has epilepsy and had a small portion removed in 2020 to alleviate his seizures and give him a better quality of life. He spent a week with wires in his brain tracking his seizures as he had them in real time. They slowly stopped his anti-seizure meds to induce them. He had 26 in one night as he slept. Once it was enough data, they removed a portion of his brain near his speech and memory center. This was the location of his misfires. The general consensus was that he had a good chance of losing his speech and memory. His personality could disappear. After his surgery, as he was being taken back to his room, he raised his arm to touch his face. The physician told him not to, and my son said, "I'm not, I just want to touch it." He spoke before he was fully out of anesthesia. 3 days later, he was home. 3 days after that, he was being transported back for emergency surgery because of a nasty infection under his skull. The surgeon later said he was maybe 12 hours from dying if he hadn't been seen. He had no symptoms other than a gross drip. No pain, no fever, nothing. Another brain surgery and 6 weeks with a drain tube and monitor on him at home with nurse visits weekly. He is now seizure-free and on a much lower dose of meds than he was previously. 1,500 daily down to 100 mg. I spent a month in the children's center helplessly watching my son slip in and out of consciousness and have hundreds of seizures. The possibility of him waking up with no memories and no way to speak was horrifying to me as his father. So, the scariest moment in my life, and keep in mind I've been shot, stabbed, and beaten, was almost losing my 16-year-old child 3 times in 1 month. Story 11. My mother woke me up in the middle of the night to tell me she had been robbed and stabbed. I had to stay with her while paramedics arrived, helped her clean her wound and put pressure on it. After she was taken to the hospital, the cops told me it was most likely self-inflicted. I will never forget the feeling I had when she told me, and the sight of it. I will also never forget the feeling of being told my mother was suicidal to the point of stabbing herself. One of the most terrifying, troubling nights of my life, and unfortunately, I have more stories that are wildly similar to that. I was 14. Story 12. Yikes. That's horrible. I had a friend go through something very similar. Her mom had 5 kids. Yet she always made my friend mother the siblings, which was already too much for a kid. My friend was in early high school and had borne the brunt of many of her mother's attention-seeking stunts. One time she came home from school to find her mother in a puddle of blood with the walls also heavily smeared with blood. The mom had waited to slit her own wrists until she knew my friend would be home to save her. I met my friend 20 years later. It's amazing how traumatized she still was from these stunts as an older adult. Having said that, my friend was also the strongest, most compassionate, brightly souled, and insightful people I've ever met. She was magnetic, beautifully dramatic, and just, simply, great people. Story 13. Not something I regularly talk about, but a couple years ago was mountain biking in Canada, crashed off a big jump and landed headfirst into hard-packed dirt. I was wearing a full-face helmet at the time and that was cracked and the chin bar split in half. Out cold, cousin had to call mountain rescue and they sent a helicopter to get me and take me to ICU, in an induced coma for 2 days. They thought I had brain damage and a broken back. Luckily, the only injuries I had were broken upper jaw and badly smashed up teeth. I had braces on at the time and the doctor said they were the only reason I still have my front 4 teeth as they were completely dislodged and held by braces. I recall absolutely nothing about the crash, just remembered waking up in hospital confused ASF. That helmet saved my life, I still have it in my room. Wear helmets. Story 14. When my dad hit my mom, she called me crying at 1 a.m. saying she'd locked herself in the bedroom. I transferred her half of their savings out immediately and went home the next day to move her out. The rage in his eyes terrified me. I kept a gun on me and didn't sleep at my own apartment until the restraining order came in. I still carry the gun. The divorce is still being finalized. I'm terrified he'll hurt her and I won't have done enough to protect her. Story 15. Okay, so this isn't as bad as some others, but here goes. When I was Tildy, 7 years old, I got a Furby for Christmas. At the time, I was ecstatic as I really wanted one. Now Furbies have their own language, which, one of the words they said sounded suspiciously like my name. My Furby couldn't be turned off save for taking out the batteries, which required a tiny screwdriver that we either didn't have or 7-year-old me couldn't find. Furbies tend to talk whenever they feel like, so I shoved my Furby in my closet and the batteries started to die. With the diminishing battery life, the Furby started to have a less than friendly sound. One night at around 3 a.m., I wake up to the demonic sound of my low-battery Furby saying my thing name. Terrified 7-year-old me evicted Furby the next morning. Story 16, had a few friends sucked out by riptide and quickly lost at sea. This happened early in the day and the search parties set out, but all we knew was that they were pulled out quick. We had hope initially that they would be recovered ragged or with minor injuries as they were fine swimmers. It took over 3 hours to get the first call. They rolled in one by one with hours in between. Each time they were found dead. You still hold hope though for the others. After the third came in dead, we were crushed but still holding hope for the rest. This went the course of 2 days and was a sustained trauma rather than a single event. Not one was saved. This is near top to the most terrifying incident in my life. I won't go into beyond that because I don't want to undo work I've done on my mental health, and I can't talk about them without reliving the experience. I will say this though, there are things you don't recover from, and it's easy to lose hope. But hope is sometimes the only thing that can save your life. No matter the situation, protect hope at all costs. Story 17. I was chased through the woods by a stranger with a bat. He seemed hell-bent on beating my brains in. I jumped in a river, held my breath and sunk to the bottom. I let the current of the river take me as far as I could until I needed another breath of air. When I came up I couldn't see him anymore. Crossed the river and hid in the woods until it got dark and hiked home. Story 18. My 6-year-old brother died mysteriously. I was 12. A short while afterwards, weeks maybe, my mother and stepfather got into a fight after a night at the bar. I woke up to hearing my mother scream my name to go get the gun. I ran to their bedroom to their closet to get a shotgun and run to the living room where he was beating her up. I pointed the gun at him and pulled the trigger. Nothing happened. It wasn't loaded. He came at me and knocked me out. I woke up the next morning in bed. I walk into the living room and my mom is scrubbing blood off the walls. He sits me on his lap and tells me he's sorry and loves us so much. My father later gets full custody of me in 1989 after I turned 13 and the summer after my 14th birthday, 1 month before starting high school, my stepfather beat my mom to death. He got second-degree manslaughter and served 120 days, let out early for being a model prisoner. Story 19. I was about 8 and slipped on a slippery rock into a small canyon with a rushing river. I remember being slammed against boulders and trying to claw my way from the freezing current. My mom was screaming and running alongside the river trying to throw a long dog leash to me, but she wasn't fast enough. I was swept downstream until I luckily got hung up on another boulder. Thankfully, I managed to take these hits with my body and not my head, and it gave my mom the chance to throw me the line and pull me out. We were camping in a remote area, and I probably should have gone to the hospital because I know now I was clearly in shock. My hands and legs were all cut up from the rocks, and I needed to be wrapped in a sleeping bag and put beside the fire where I shivered for hours. Bonus story. I was wasted and sunbathing on a beach in Cuba. Walked down from the main area where the lifeguards were to sun topless away from the crowds. In my stupor, I see someone in the water flailing and waving their arms. My boyfriend at the time had gone to get drinks, and I remember standing alone on the beach for a while trying to decide if this person was actually in trouble. Finally decided that yes, something was wrong, and I went out there, maybe 60 m into the water. It was this 60-70-year-old lady who immediately clung to me. She was hysterical and kept saying she had almost given up. I grabbed her and told her we would go forward when the waves pushed to shore, but when the current pulled away, we would try to hold our ground. We were probably in a rip and should have gone sideways, but like I said, I was very drunk. Problem was she was exhausted and almost immediately gave up and went dead weight, which started pulling me out too, and I was taking on water. I looked her dead in the eyes and told her if she didn't start moving, I was going to leave her there. Literally prepared to punch this senior off of me to save myself. She found the energy, and we slowly managed our way in. Felt like it took forever. Once we hit the shore, she collapsed, and my boyfriend and her daughter ran up from wherever they were. She was bawling, and they needed to get the cart to come get her. I was very shaken and felt such shame that I'd told his woman I would leave her to die if she didn't move. The next day, she and her daughter found me in the resort to thank me. I was so ashamed I could barely talk to her. They took some pictures of us and even ended up emailing one to me. It's surreal to have someone be so thankful despite knowing you were ready to condemn them to death. Story 20. I was drugged by someone in Vegas on a girls' trip. They kept insisting we drink their alcohol even though girls drank free at this bar. Not sure how it happened, but assuming he slipped something in my drink. He had a super creepy brother that at the time just seemed introverted, but looking back should have tipped us off. The guy wasn't overly pushy, but stayed around us quite a bit. Made comments to my friend about how, even though I had a BF, he didn't understand because he liked me, as if I was property. She picked up on enough red flags that she got us to leave. She'd asked me to take my shoes off because she said she felt we might have to run. These guys really scared her, so hard to put into words. When we left, I was hallucinating and doing some really embarrassing things that I won't even say as an anonymous person. She said I would go from being really with it to being like a loose noodle on the floor of the elevator, and she worried we wouldn't get back to our room. When we finally did make it back, she said I insisted all the people in our room leave. There were no people. She had to change me and put me on the toilet. I was a puking ragdoll. I woke up the next morning with what I can only describe as a complete blackout. What I would picture going to sleep for surgery like. There were no bits and pieces, it was all black. I'd had 2 drinks before we ran into this person. I still have no idea what his and his brother's intentions were, but it makes me sick. I flew home on the next available flight. Story 21. My wife went past her due date, so her doctor decided to induce the pregnancy. It did not go well. After a dozen hours of no progress, the hospital told us that if we didn't do an emergency C-section, our son would likely die. The whole thing was a blur. I barely remember going to the operating room. My feet were like lead the whole time. Outwardly, I was keeping it together, but inside it was sheer panic. Thankfully, we were at a top-notch hospital and the C-section went great. However, when we got to the postpartum room, it was pretty clear something was wrong with my son. When babies are born, they kind of look like little old prune men and not chunky Stay Puft marshmallows. So, you can imagine the concern we had when we see his ribcage outlines every time he gasps for breath while pumping his tiny little chest in and out. We alerted the nurse, and she went to the center station to figure out what to do. I overheard her from inside our room, emphatically telling the doctor on call that he needed to be moved to the NICU ASAP. You know, in movies when a character experiences a moment of panic, time slows down, noise becomes garbled, and they just kind of drift? That happened to me. The nurse pulled me out of the room and explained what was going to happen, and I'm just trying to keep it together as I listen. They informed me that because my wife was still recuperating, she would not be able to go up into the NICU yet, so it was just me, at like 3 o'clock in the morning, having to endure them putting needles and IVs into this tiny little life we had made. He ended up being fine, just a little extra fluid in his lungs, and we were out in 4 days, which is nothing compared to many of the parents in a NICU. This was and still is the scariest experience of my life. Story 22. When I was 10, nearly being electrocuted, I was standing on my skateboard in the garage, almost lost my balance, so I put one hand on the washer and another on the freezer. The current locked me up. I couldn't let go. I was stuck there in pain until my mom saw that something was wrong and knocked me loose. If not for her, I'd be dead. My parents bought new appliances after that. Story 23. When I was 10, nearly being electrocuted, I was standing on my skateboard in the garage, almost lost my balance, so I put one hand on the washer and another on the freezer. The current locked me up. I couldn't let go. I was stuck there in pain until my mom saw that something was wrong and knocked me loose. If not for her, I'd be dead. My parents bought new appliances after that. Story 24. Mother yanking the steering wheel of the car while I was driving on the freeway. I was brand new to driving and hadn't yet gotten my license. I had a permit that allowed me to drive as long as I had a designated driver in the passenger seat. We were on the freeway, and she was directing me towards the exit. She told me to get off on the next, right, so I did. She suddenly screamed at the top of her lungs, "No, not this exit." And she grabbed the bottom of the steering wheel and pulled. She was trying to make the car turn left. She didn't pull it hard enough to flip us, but she did pull it hard enough to swerve us almost immediately right back into traffic. We were going at least 60 miles an hour. I managed to slam on the brakes and right the steering wheel to keep us from crashing. By some miracle, the car behind us managed to slam on the brakes and swerve around us so we weren't in an accident. Mom then proceeded to yell at me for having a panic attack, screaming, "You don't stop in the middle of the freeway, go go go." She refused to let me pull over and then complained about my erratic driving for the next half an hour while I went through a literal panic attack. One of the scariest moments of my life, and I still have trouble driving to this day due to PTSD. I cannot go on freeways. Story 25. Warning, creepy stepdad story. Shortly after my creepy stepdad decided to shove his hand down my pants in the middle of the broad, sober daylight, I let him know, in a diary entry that he read, that I knew he thought he was seducing me and, long story short, made it clear that if he thought he could get away with that, he'd better be damn sure he was prepared to get away with murder too. The next 8 months were terrifying because he took it like a rejection and started doing this gaslighting thing where he'd stare at me until I objected and then call me a narcissist for thinking everyone's always paying attention to me. He impersonated me online to my friends to get them to tell him confidential things, and basically, I managed the next 8 months with a poker face sitting on a rolling cauldron of anxiety like a lid on a crock pot. Then my mom and we got the F out. Edit, thank you for the ups and heartwarming. Edits for clarity, and some answers in the thread. My mom didn't know it was happening because I deliberately hid it from her for tactical reasons. I couldn't risk him convincing her I was lying if she confronted him. We've had our struggles, but we have a tiny farm now, and we're better than ever. Asterisk. We were atheists. Prior to this, my mom describes it as a vision-like experience. We've both had other experiences since then, but nothing prior to Jesus appearing to my mom in a dream. Story 26, slipping down the stairs while holding my infant daughter. Kept her upright while my leg went underneath me, and then my knee smashed the concrete at the bottom of the stairs. Almost blacked out from the pain. Edit. Since I'm apparently not the only one, I figured I'd add a little more detail. Sorry in advance for these extended director's cut. It had been raining early and the stairs were very slippery. We were on our way out to meet my BIL and his fam for dinner. My wife was already in the garage and didn't see me fall. I screamed for her to come get our daughter before I dropped her. When she did, I managed to get my leg out from under me. I knew things were not good. It was pain like I hadn't felt since I broke and dislocated my wrist when I was a kid. All I could say is I F up over and over again. My wife quickly called her brother and asked them to come and watch Sadie. She called 911 because I started to go into shock. I started to get super clammy and cold. I couldn't stand, but I said there was no way I was getting into an ambulance. The fire truck arrived first, and they were nice enough to carry me and put me in the back seat of my car. Not an easy task because I'm 6'4", and probably weighed around 180 lbs at the time. So off we went to the ER. When we got there, they took me in and the nurse kept messing with my leg. I was in excruciating pain and she just said, "I have to see if anything is torn," as she tried to take my leg and bend my knee. I kept telling her to stop and eventually told her not to touch me anymore. She was mad, but I didn't care. Then a tech came to take me for x-rays. Once that was done and we were walking back, the tech looked at me and said, "Man, I'm not supposed to say nothing, but I know you must be in a lot of pain." Once I was back in the room, they eventually came in and told me I had fractured my distal femur. The nurse that had been trying to manhandle my leg came back to apologize, stating she had no idea. It was a long recovery, and I still can feel the injury. But I just live with it and try to stay active as much as possible. I don't know how I was able to hold on to my girl other than there was no other option. I would do it again, every day for the rest of my life if I had to. Story 27. The day before my 19th birthday, I was in a car crash, on my way to go CX skiing. I was in the passenger seat of the car talking to the guy who was driving about something dumb, but trying to make it profound. As we were talking, he was in the wrong lane and started to miss the off-ramp, and I said, "You were supposed to go left." He said, "Oh yeah," and quickly merged across 2 lanes to make it in time. Well, we would have, but since it was early and cold, the road was slick. He slid and overcorrected and ended up rolling his car to the right. We rolled several times, which was pretty neat as it was kind of fun. After we stopped and I processed what happened, I checked to make sure he was okay and not dead, and also to ensure I wasn't dead. He was freaking out, but was glad we were both uninjured. Then our faces lit up, which was the scary part. We started on the left lane going the right way and ended up in the far right lane facing the wrong direction. So our faces lighting up was from the headlights of oncoming cars. That 1/32 of a second of realization was terrifying because I thought we were going to get hit by the cars. But then, as I was able to turn my head and look, I saw that they were slowing down and stopping to help, and it was like 6 a.m. on a Saturday, so not many people would be out then anyways. Still, that terror wasn't great. Story 28. I've talked about this here before, albeit not in a top-level comment. Scariest thing ever was waking up in an ICU bed with a vent tube in my throat, and no idea what had become of my babies. The day they were born, I woke up, got out of bed, and looked down to see blood running onto the floor. Assumed placental abruption, a premature separation of that organ that can lead to stillbirth. So I got transported to the hospital on the double. Side note, being in an ambulance and hearing them flip on the sirens to not wait at the red light is pretty scary on its own. Shoved into an ER room that was already occupied where they did an ultrasound and told me both babies had heartbeats, and thence taken to an OR. I knew I was going to be knocked out for the C-section, but I did not in any way expect the whole ICU bit. Turns out I was in surgery for 10 hours, had the entirety of my blood volume replaced, and lost several bits and bobs to placenta accreta, in which the placenta grows through the uterine wall and can grow into the bladder in extreme cases. So, all of that was awful and traumatic, but for some reason no one updated me on my babies. I've looked at the OR notes. I know their 5-minute APGARs were good, and they were taken to the NICU in stable condition, so that wasn't a factor. I can only imagine they were just that unused to maternity patients and didn't think to update me. And with the ventilator, I could not speak, and no one thought to offer a notepad or any other means of communication. And of course I was loopy as F on pain meds and the sedation they kept turning back up because I was so agitated. Thankfully, both babies are fine, but the hours that passed before the doctor who cheerfully told me I'd never need another pap smear, thought to tell me they'd both made it, will always be the worst of my life. And I have held another baby while she died. Story 29. My husband got caught in a riptide and was quickly pulled away from shore while I watched in terror. We were on a private beach, and he is not a great swimmer, and once he disappeared, I was sure he would drown. Luckily, he was fine and managed to get out of it and let the waves carry him to shore. I say luckily, because while someone did call 911, the response was cops without a boat or sea-doo or anything to go out and find him. Worst moments of my life at PTSD for a few years after that. Story 30. My husband and I got caught in one together. I was boogie boarding, so I was further out and I heard him yelling for help. I thought he had lost his swim trunks or something. He had been getting pummeled by waves for a while and couldn't fight them anymore. He didn't know how to get out of a riptide and was in full-blown panic mode, thinking he was about to die. I made my way over to him and gave him the boogie board, thinking he needed it more than me since he was worn out. But then I started drifting away and thought, yep, this is it. He'll make it back and I'll die on our anniversary trip. Thankfully, I made it back to him and we eventually got back to shore. It was October, so there were no lifeguards, just one couple calmly watching us almost drown. It really shook him up. I'm not sure how close we actually were to drowning, but he legitimately thought he was going to die. Going into don't let your husband drown mode kept me from being too scared, but I don't think he's planning on getting back in the ocean anytime soon. Story 31. This happened about 5 or 6 years back. It was garbage day. I just took my trash out to the curb. I was sitting on my porch. It was a beautiful summer day without a cloud in the sky. I'm petting my dog and drinking some tea, relaxing after a hard day's work. At the time, I lived near the corner of a busy main street. A police officer pulls a man over. This was not an uncommon thing for me to see when I was living there, so I think it is just normal police stop. I figure the guy's going to get a ticket, nothing to write home about. He was just speeding. Gunshot! Oh, ish! The guy getting pulled over drew a gun on the cop and took a shot at the cop. He hit him in the foot. Officer down, but not out. Another police car shows up right when the shooting started. That other cop got out and started firing at the suspect. It just so happens the suspect was between me and the officer firing at him. One of the officer's bullet hit my trash can. I just taken the trash out 5 minutes earlier. The cop that was shot in the foot then opens fire with the other officer. The two of them must have shot the guy at least a dozen times. I saw it all from only a stone throw away. Story 32. I've been a corrections officer and a truck driver hauling heavy equipment. I lived for 35 years with a family member across the street from me, if not on the same piece of property, and in 2021, I moved from Texas to Florida by myself without a family member within 1,000 miles of me. As a corrections officer, I've been on the cell extraction team that goes into the cell when an inmate won't cooperate. I've picked a man up off the ground who shoved razor blades in his dick hole, then pulled them out and then swallowed the blades. I've responded to an officer being assaulted ICS where the officer stopped communicating. In 7th grade, I fell on a pine tree after school and had a 3 inches diameter, 5 inches deep hole on my inner left thigh 2 inches away from my groin in a time before cell phones. I received 180 stitches and missed 2 months of school and an entire summer. The absolute scariest experience of my life was my mother's funeral. Story 33. Kitchen fire almost suffocating me and my parents. Couple of years ago, I was visiting our family vacation home with my sisters and parents. While making dinner one evening, there was a power outage due to a storm. My mom accidentally left an oil-filled pan on the stove during the outage. We have an old electric stove, and when the power went back on during the night, we were sleeping. It caught fire and it quickly spread around. During the night, around 2 a.m., I woke up not able to breathe. For some reason, I immediately went to the kitchen. The memory is a bit hazy, but I'll never forget the sight of the whole kitchen being ablaze. The fire also reached a cabinet with bottles of liquor, which started exploding due to the heat. Meanwhile, my parents were still fast asleep in the room next to the kitchen. At this point, I started screaming that there was a fire. Luckily, my parents quickly woke up. In the end, we managed to extinguish the fire. We had some minor injuries due to inhaling the smoke and major damage to the house. However, all things considered, we got lucky. But damn, I'll never forget the sight of the fire raging through the kitchen, knowing my parents were directly next to it. Story 34. About 3 years ago, during all the COVID lockdowns, I was staying with a friend to smoke some weed and hang out with some family friends. That entire day leading up, I had been driving around town doing DoorDash and hadn't had much to eat, and definitely way too much caffeine to help keep me awake. I stopped smoking earlier than everyone else because I started feeling lightheaded, and I'm a lightweight compared to everyone else who was in the circle. Everyone notices that my friend's mom had finished cooking some barbecue, so we all went to the kitchen to eat. I had maybe a single bite of chicken before I started hearing a high-pitched ringing in my ears, and suddenly, I passed out. Woke up on the floor of the kitchen, and apparently I'd hit my head twice on my way down. My friend's mom was a nurse, so she helped me get some ice and sit on the couch. She told me that it looked like I had had a seizure because I was shaking uncontrollably after my fall. Must have been like 10 minutes later when I woke up on the floor again next to the couch and had apparently had another seizure on the couch. Fast forward to my brother picking me up and taking me to the ER. My dad worked for the hospital, was currently on his late night shift, and requested we got a quiet room to sit in. They moved us to this small room with chairs lining the walls, all facing towards the center. My dad was obviously really scared and just trying to make conversation when I started feeling lightheaded again. Woke up on the floor with my dad above me yelling for a doctor. Blacked out again and woke up to a bright light in my face and doctors all around. Doctor told me he was going to pump me up with drugs to knock me out, and all I could manage was a thumbs up before I was out again. In the end, I survived and was okay to go home after 3 days of being in the hospital. I'm on medication now for my seizures and try to be careful to drink water, eat food, and not smoke that much anymore. They still don't know what caused the seizures, and I've had a few since, but I haven't had one in over 2 years now, so I'm doing much better. The ringing in my ears never went away though. Story 35. almost dying due to neglect while being involuntarily psychiatrically hospitalized. I ended up being Baker-acted for going to an urgent care when I felt like my antidepressants weren't working right. I was having flashing thoughts of suicide, emotional outbursts, etc. And I didn't want to wait for my psychiatrist's office to open up on Monday. This took place on a Friday evening, so I decided to go to urgent care because I didn't feel safe. The admitting nurse says he doesn't think they need to Baker-act me because I voluntarily came in, but the head nurse decided otherwise. I knew nothing about being Baker-acted upon going to the urgent care, including not knowing you can't self-medicate while involuntarily hospitalized. This is about the time I mention I'm a type 1 diabetic. I get to the psychiatric center and realize my insulin pump is almost out of insulin. I mentioned to the check-in nurse that I'm going to need my purse back, had to surrender that upon entering the waiting room, to change out my insulin pump site, but then I swear I'll give it right back. She informs me that's not going to happen and that I'm not allowed to self-medicate in their care. I reiterate to her I don't have much of a choice. I need my insulin to literally survive. She tells me a nurse will be in to check my blood sugar, cause that's totally going to solve the no insulin issue. Okay, 14 hours later I'm still in that waiting room waiting to be admitted, and my insulin pump is beyond empty, and I still haven't even had my blood sugar checked. Lo and behold, a nurse finally comes to check my blood sugar and it's so high they call EMS to transport me to a nearby hospital. EMS and the doctor at the hospital scold me for letting myself get to such a state. I try explaining to anyone who will listen what happened and begging to not be returned to that center, asking if I can do my hospitalization in this hospital instead. No such luck. After they stabilize me, they ship me right back to the psychiatric center. This time I'm only waiting 7 hours before I'm finally admitted, still with no insulin. Cue the next 72 hours of mandatory hospitalization. I'm dancing around psychiatrists, playing every mental game I can muster trying to get discharged because each minute I spend in this center is another minute without my proper medication, that once again, I need to literally survive. Thankfully I had an amazing roommate, shout out to you Susan, I'll never forget you, and I'm pretty resourceful. I took to picking through my meals and eating as low carb as possible to help offset the need for insulin. When I inevitably began throwing up because my body was going into shock without my medicine, my roommate helped hide the evidence so the center wouldn't use it as an excuse to detain me for longer. I'm not being paranoid here, they 100% would've. She also helped fight off guards who kept checking on me while I was laying down trying to literally not die by telling them I was just sad, tired, and needed to rest. I also managed to get away with throwing up in the yard once and no one caught it, so that was fun. I thankfully was able to call my husband and alert him to the situation, so when they did release me, he had my insulin pump set up and waiting for me as soon as I walked out those doors, a free woman. It took months for me to not be paranoid that they would find me and drag me back. Still have nightmares about it to this day. TLDR, I was involuntarily psychiatrically hospitalized as a type 1 diabetic, denied my insulin while hospitalized, and had to fight off diabetic ketoacidosis for 72 hours until I was released. Literally almost died. Fun add-on. While there, I witnessed the guards locking the patients they deemed annoying outside while laughing about it. Thanks for watching, subscribe for more videos, take care.